Hello guys, welcome back to Rewind Reviews. Today we're going to be doing a movie from 2022 and that is the final movie of Marvel Studios Phase 4, Black Panther, Wakanda Forever. In the sequel to the 2018 movie, the people of Wakanda fight to protect their home from the intervening world powers as they mourn the death of King T'Challa. Ryan Coogler returns to write and direct, alongside co-writer Joe Robert Cole. The movie also features the acting talent of Letitia Wright, Lupita Nyong'o, Dana Guerra, Winston Duke, Angela Bassett, Talocan Major, Martin Freeman, Dominique Thorne, Florence Kasumba and Michaela Cole. So when it comes to the first Black Panther movie, I thought it was really good. I thought it was very well made. It did have a few issues and I wouldn't necessarily say it was my favourite movie in the entire MCU. I mean, there is a lot of competition, but I really like the character, I liked his story, I loved the villain, I loved the location of Wakanda. Everything about it does work very well and I was really happy to see this character being brought to life on the big screen. And even though I'm a bigger Spider-Man fan, I will quite happily admit that he was one of the best characters in Civil War. And of course, the first one did very well, so a sequel was announced not too long afterwards. I was very curious what direction that they were going to go with it because of everything that was kind of happening within the MCU, with Infinity War and Endgame being like the bridge between both Black Panther movies. But then very sadly Chadwick Boseman did pass away in 2020. And unfortunately that did put Marvel in a bit of a predicament of what direction for them to go, because according to what I've heard from Ryan Coogler himself, it does sound like they actually had already finished a script for the new movie, so that had to be completely changed. So the question really kind of became a case of, would they recast T'Challa or not? And I've definitely got my own thoughts on it, and I was very curious to see what direction Marvel would take with it. They opted not to recast, so they had to change the story, the script. I don't know how much of it was altered, because I feel like there are definitely elements in this that might have still been in the original draft. I think I was definitely worried about what the quality of this movie was going to be, because they were still pushing ahead with the movie kind of coming out within like 2021, 2022, plus we had the pandemic sort of pushing everything back a little bit, so there was a bit of a rush to get this one done. And then mix that in with the fact that Phase 4 hasn't exactly been as stellar as a few of the other phases have been, especially when it comes to the movies, because I don't think any of them have been as good as I think they really could have been, apart from like one or two exceptions. So I was very curious to see what this movie would be like, and now having actually seen it, I can quite happily say that this is not only one of the best movies that Marvel has produced in 2022, but honestly I would say it's one of the best movies in Phase 4. It's dramatic, it's engaging, it is very emotional, and it does act as a tribute to Chadwick Boseman and his legacy, and I think that is very well handled. But I wouldn't necessarily say that this was an absolutely flawless movie. There are definitely a few problems, and I'm going to go through them in a little bit, but I want to sort of go through a few other aspects first. One of the best aspects of this movie is by far the cast. More specifically, Angela Bassett and Letitia Wright. They are both forced into the forefront of this movie, where they are mostly the main protagonists of this film. When it comes to Angela Bassett, I thought she was really good in the first movie, but she is absolutely phenomenal in this one. And then Letitia Wright in this as well. I mean, in the first movie I didn't mind her, I thought she was very good, but I had seen her in other things and I knew just how good an actress she could be. This one really gives her the opportunity to really show off just how good she is. I don't think that Shuri was ever meant to be a bigger character than she was in the first movie, but I think that they have done a very natural thing. They have managed to progress the character a bit more, and Letitia Wright really does step up to play this role. There's also a load of returning characters from the first movie like Okoye and M'Baku. They're probably the biggest standouts apart from Shuri and the Queen in this, because I think that both Dana Guerra and Winston Duke are both on absolute top form in this one. I think Dana Guerra gives an absolutely fantastic performance, but when it comes to Winston Duke and M'Baku, I think that his performance in the first movie was brilliant. He was by far one of my favourite characters of the first movie, so I was wondering what else they were going to do with him in this one. And he is an absolute scene stealer in this film. There are definitely times where he does have the gravitas that is needed for this, but he does have some of the funniest scenes as well, and I think that most of his lines really do land. The issue is that there's so much that is going on in this movie that they do kind of get pushed to the background a little bit more than they were in the first film. Like M'Baku doesn't have that much screen time in this one, even though he does have some great scenes, but I don't think he has nearly enough screen time as he did in the first movie. And that's also the case with Lupita Nyong'o as well, because she was quite a prominent role in the first movie, but this one she is barely really in it. She does have some good scenes and she does deliver an absolutely fantastic performance as always, but I just would have liked to have seen a bit more of her character. We do spend a lot of time with two other characters who aren't part of Wakanda, and it does feel like maybe those scenes could have been trimmed down a little bit. There is definitely some revelations within those sequences, but I just don't feel like they were as important to this movie as I think the movie sort of portrays it as. And then we have the introduction of Dominique Thorne as Riri Williams, aka Ironheart. I feel like when it comes to her character, her introduction is very similar to Peter Parker in Civil War, the way that she's introduced, and I think the performance by Dominique is good. I think she is fine in the role, but I do kind of get the feeling that maybe she was only included into this to kind of just set up her own show and potentially set up a Young Avengers film. She doesn't really have a huge impact on everything that happens in the movie outside of one thing. I think because they are going to leave it to her own series to really sort of go into her backstory a lot more, that we don't really sort of find out too much about her. So I'm a bit 50-50 with her character. She is fine. I think she is a likeable character, but I just think they could have done a little bit more with her. But then we have the introduction of a character that I've been really looking forward to seeing if they would ever actually introduce this character at some point. He's one of the oldest Marvel Comics characters, and I have no idea what was going on with the movie rights for him. I thought they were with Universal, but maybe they weren't, I'm not quite sure. So what they've actually managed to finally do is introduce into the MCU Namor. Tenoch Huerta is absolutely phenomenal in this role, and I think the way that he's been written as well is perfect for this character, where he is the antagonist of this movie, but he does have a very clear motivation and goal. They have changed his origin quite a bit for this movie, but I think that it does work very well for the story that they are trying to tell and how it connects into the wider MCU. But right down to the way he acts and his personality, where he can be really charming but he can be a bit of a dick at times. This is Namor, and I'm really happy with how they've portrayed him. I was quite curious what direction they were going to go with his design, because I'll admit it is a pretty odd design for this character, but I think they've adapted it very well into live action. The Mayan decision, or the decision to sort of have him be influenced by like Mayan culture, is interesting, and I wasn't really sure about how they'd handle that within context of the movie, but I think that it actually does work quite well, and it is a very unique look. I shouldn't really doubt Marvel at this point, but I was quite curious to see if they actually would do the feathers on the ankles, and they actually do, and he does fly. And the way that he moves and operates both in the sea and in the air, it's very good. And then when it comes to the Talocans, you know, the Atlanteans, the design for them I think is very unique. I think, yeah, there is definitely that Mayan influence still present in there. I think that the way that they are presented on screen is really good, very unique as well. There's a bit more of a tribal sort of aesthetic to it all, and I think the way that it's subtle technology that they have, but it's just sort of enough where it sort of looks a bit different from everything else that we have seen that's more like sci-fi-esque. I think their water bombs are absolutely amazing, but I do like this very subtle thing that they do, which I didn't really clock onto at first, and it's because when you see them, like if you've seen the posters or the trailers, you will have seen it with like blue skin, or like bluish white sort of skin, but that's only when they're outside of water. When they're actually in, they just look normal. I think it's a really interesting direction for them to go in. I think it really does help separate this version of Atlantis to DC's one. Yeah, for anyone who isn't aware, in the Marvel Comics universe, Talocan, as it's called in the movies, is actually Atlantis within the Marvel universe, and of course DC got there first with Aquaman, so they had to rename it to something called Talocan instead. And I like how what they've done to try and separate it from that, because it is more the Mayan focused culture that they have gone for, whereas Atlantis in Aquaman was just like a really advanced sci-fi location underwater. It's really bright and colourful, whereas Talocan is a bit darker and I think it's a bit more believable. It kind of reminds me a little bit of El Dorado from the animated film. I do like the look, I do like the design, I think it is very good. Certainly helps it's a bit more practical as well, because they actually do have like these pretty magnificent sets that like all the stalagmites from the ceiling and all sorts. It does look very believable, and I like that it is very realistic. There's also a really nice contrast between what they've done with Talocan and Wakanda as well. There are scenes where you kind of see what the culture's like in the markets and things like that, and I like how they do that to kind of separate the two nations. It looks lived in, it looks like people do live there, and I think that it really has been adapted very well. I think most of the costume looks have actually been adapted pretty well into live action, especially when it comes to like the Jabari as well, because they've sort of updated their look a little bit, like with M'Baku, because like he's still got like the big fur collar around his neck, but his chest plate has now got like the face of a gorilla on it, and it just looks really good. The costume designs for the people of Wakanda is really good. It was very good in the first movie, but they've kind of adapted it and tweaked it a little bit for this one. I think that it is translated very well. That being said, there's a few costumes that are introduced into this movie that did give me Power Ranger vibes. And when you see Ironheart on screen in her like proper Ironheart costume, somebody said it looked like Metroid, and I can't unsee it. But it is a good design. I do like how you do kind of see the evolution of that throughout the film. Now, I'm not going to say who's actually wearing the suit, but I will say the new Black Panther costume, I like it. It does look good. There is definitely a reason behind why it looks the way it does, like a deeper meaning behind it. But at the same time, to me, the Black Panther suit needs to be a bit more of a stealth costume, and I don't really think that this would be really good in the dark. I like that it is a bit more practical. They've got rid of like the big purple flashy light show that the one for the first movie had. Even though I liked all the pattern and all the way that it sort of lit up, and it kind of felt a bit like the comics where like every time the light sort of hit me, I had like a bluey sort of purple look. That's kind of what it was referencing. I was never really a big fan of it, so I am happy that it has gone a bit more back to what it was in like the Civil War days, which by far is still my favourite Black Panther suit. When it comes to the overall story for this, it's a little bit of a mixed bag for me. I do think overall it is a very good story. I think that it really does have this great emotional story. It is character driven, it is completely dedicated to these characters and them dealing with their struggles. But there are a lot of elements to this movie, and I wouldn't necessarily say it was messy, but I do think that it needs to have a bit more time dedicated to a few aspects of it. The biggest emotional impact of this movie is the story of the death of T'Challa and the impact that that has on Shuri and the nation of Wakanda. And that by far is the most interesting part of this movie. It's definitely the most engaging. It's the bit that I was most looking forward to seeing what it was that they were going to do. And it is handled very well. You're kind of thrown straight into it. It doesn't really give a reason for what's happened. It just sort of mentions it and you kind of have to just sort of move on with it. So I do feel like maybe they could have addressed it just a little bit, but the story is handled very sensitively, and I do think that it is very well handled. And honestly, it's nice just having something serious for once. That was something that I did like about the first movie, where it was taking things a little bit more seriously. There was definitely a focus on some of the more political angles, like what's going on with Wakanda and their place in the world. And that story is continued into this one. It does feel very natural. It does feel like this is definitely the direction that they were always going to go. And I do like how Talocan and Namor and all those characters are integrated into this. It does feel very natural, and I think that the way that it's handled, it is very believable. And I like how it is that they've approached that nation, because they do feel like they have been around for a very long time and they have been hidden, and it does make sense. And there is an attempt to really sort of merge those two stories together, because I'm desperately trying not to get into spoilers here. I will be doing a spoiler review for this movie a little bit later on. So all I'll say is there's a bit of a time jump between what happens with T'Challa and what's going on with Wakanda and Talocan. And when it comes to all the stuff with Namor, that to me feels like the stuff that might have already been in the script prior to the rewrite. I do think it is a good story. It does carry a lot of the themes that were in the first movie, but it doesn't always gel together as well as I think it could have done, because there are definitely elements where I feel like it needed to be a lot more of a personal story, and of course this is a big Marvel film, so it does kind of need to have those bigger moments. The balance is okay and it doesn't really bother me too much, but it can get a little bit jumbled. Like very early on, Shuri's got a bit of a crisis of faith and they never really sort of address it until like near the very end, and it just sort of feels a bit like, was that meant to be a bit more important to the story? And then even though I didn't mind it, I do think that the way that Riri Williams is introduced into this movie, it does kind of feel like the story sort of like gets a bit sidetracked, and I feel like maybe they could have either expanded on it a bit more and made it sort of fit a bit more fluidly into this, or potentially just remove it. I know they probably are trying to follow the comics when it comes to her origin story, which I do appreciate, but at the same time I feel like maybe there could have been a way of adapting her origin to fit a bit more within the world of Wakanda. So they're probably my biggest nitpicks when it comes to the story. There are definitely a lot of parallels to other movies as well, like Iron Man 2's one that sort of jumps out at me in terms of like the main story. Plus one certain character does go on a journey very similar to another character from one of the earlier movies, which I'm not going to spoil here. I do think it is a little bit quicker than how it is handled in that movie, but I think that it is done very well, and I think that the actors really do sell it, so it doesn't bother me whatsoever. It is very well handled. I really did like the cinematography a lot more in this one compared to the first one. I think that Ryan Coogler does seem a bit more confident behind the camera when it comes to some of the bigger sequences in this, especially when it comes to the action sequences, because they do feel a lot bigger, they're so much more intense. I think the way that they've got a sort of contrast of two different characters, where you've got like the more grounded ones and then the Talocans and Namor as well, who's able to fly. I think that they balanced that stuff really well. The best action sequences in the first movie were the ones on the waterfall because of how realistic they were, and that brutality is carried over into this one. I honestly would say this is a lot more brutal than the first movie because it does get quite violent. So people getting stabbed, people getting burned, people getting drowned. It's really extreme at times. So I will say, if you do have young kids who want to see this, I'd probably watch it before they do, just so you have an idea of what they're getting in for. But I do think the cinematography as a whole is brilliant for this movie. I love how everything is shot and framed in this one. I love like the sequence where they go down into Talocan, we kind of see everything. I think it is handled very well. I think the funeral and the memorial are handled really well too. I think the lighting is really nice, apart from one scene. There's a scene really early on which I think that's been released online, and it's the first time that we actually get to properly meet Namor. It is a good scene. I do like how it is done, it is handled, but I do think that it is very dark. I thought it might have been just me, the cinema that I was in, maybe it was just the projector or something like that, but I have talked to a couple of people and they've said the exact same thing. But other than that, I do think the cinematography is very good. And I really do appreciate that we actually get some proper underwater sequences as well. Comparing it to the Distinguished Competition DC, the underwater sequences in those movies, they were definitely a little bit more CGI focused, where it is just people within a blue screen studio. There was one or two underwater sequences in Batman v Superman, and I think Justice League as well, but I don't think they looked as good as I really thought that they could have been. And then contrast with this one, I think that the underwater sequences actually are handled really well. I think that they have managed to adapt it very nicely. It also helps that the CGI is a lot better in this movie than it is compared to the first one, because it does blur things together very nicely. I've got to be honest, it's actually quite refreshing seeing that the effects in a Marvel film are actually quite good. I think this is definitely some of the best that they have done in a little while, but there are definitely a few issues here and there. There are definitely a few CG characters which don't quite look right, or things that just look a little bit off. Biggest ones for me are more like the green screen sequences, because it is a bit iffy and I don't think it quite works, but it isn't distracting and it doesn't take you out of the movie. So I did say a little bit earlier that I was happy that this movie does take itself a little bit more seriously than most of the other Marvel films that we've had this year. I really do appreciate that, considering not only that Marvel has kind of gone a bit too comedic at times, but because this is handling a very sensitive subject, I do think that it needed to be serious, and I think that it is very well handled. And I will admit it can be a little bit tough to watch at times, because there are some very emotional sequences, but it does have a few comedic moments, and I do think that they are needed in this one to kind of just lighten up just a little bit. Most of those come from M'Baku, and I think that his stuff is very funny. It definitely had my audience laughing a lot. There are definitely a few other gags here and there, and not all of them land as well as I think they could do, but I think most of them are fine. It's balanced well and it comes from character, so it does fit very well. Also appreciate that it does kind of dip into horror a little bit in a few sequences, especially when it comes to Talocan and the way that they handle all of the people, because there's a sequence really early on that is definitely influenced by historical mythology, and it is actually quite creepy and a bit eerie when these things actually do show up on screen before you even know what they are. So I really do appreciate that. I think it's really elevated through the music by Ludwig Göransson. It's very atmospheric, those sequences, and I think that it is really well handled. And when it comes to the music overall, I think that Ludwig Göransson has made an incredible soundtrack for the first movie, and he does carry a lot of that over into this one. There's a bit more of a techno sort of vibe that he's added into this, so it does help separate it enough from the first movie, so you could hear this and quite easily say this is from Wakanda Forever. The soundtrack is really good, and it does work very well for each sequence that the music is used in. When it comes to some of the song choices, I'm going to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of this style of music, so I'm not going to be able to say like, oh, it's absolutely amazing. It is good, it does work for this movie, and it does enhance a lot of those sequences. There is one scene which does kind of focus a lot on emotions between two particular characters, and I feel like maybe they should have just like toned the music off for that sequence, because I do feel like it's a little bit distracting. But it is a good soundtrack overall. I love Namor's theme and the theme of Talocan. I love the new themes for Black Panther and a few of the other characters as well. It is a great soundtrack, and it is really worth a listen to. Overall, this movie had a lot of expectations for it, and I think it does deliver. This is a great movie. It's a good addition to the MCU. I honestly will say it's the best movie that they have made from 2022, and I'd go so far as to say it's probably my second favourite MCU film from Phase 4. It's got a great story, it's got great performances, the effects are much better, I think the action is really good. I do think it does have a few problems here and there, but they're not distracting, they don't take you out of the movie, and honestly the good vastly outweighs the bad. It has to be a big action movie, but it also has to be a fitting tribute for Chadwick Boseman, and I think it is balanced very well. It's by far one of the most personal movies in the MCU, and I do think that it is very good. It's a big Marvel superhero action movie, but it's also a really loving tribute to Chadwick Boseman, and it is handled and balanced so well. I'm really happy with how this movie turned out. Phase 4 has officially gone out with a bang, and I'm really pleased with it. I'm actually quite looking forward to seeing what Phase 5 has in store, if this is the quality that we are going to be getting from now on. So with all that being said, my rating for Black Panther Wakanda Forever is an 8 out of 10. I really did enjoy this movie. It was a really good experience, and honestly I would highly recommend it for general audiences, Marvel fans, people who love the first movie. I think this is a really great movie, and I highly would recommend checking it out. So that's pretty much everything I've got to say for today's episode, so thank you so much for watching. If you like this content, please like, please subscribe, hit the notification button to keep up to date on everything that's going on this channel. I will be releasing a spoiler talk very soon, so if you do want to say any thoughts down below, make sure you try and keep them as spoiler free as possible. Wait for the spoiler video to come out before you start saying anything like that. But if you do have any thoughts, let me know down in the comments. Plus, if you have any recommendations for any movies, TV shows or games that you'd like me to do a rewind review for, let me know down in the comments. Thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you next time on Rewind Reviews. See you guys.